This is A New Angle, a show about cool people doing awesome things in and around Montana. I'm your host, Justin Angle. This show is supported by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Hey folks, welcome back, and thanks for tuning in. It is Climate Week here at Montana Public Radio, and we're just a short couple weeks away from Climate Smart Missoula's Climate Solutions Week. So, in that spirit, today I am speaking with Mark Kreider, a newly minted Ph.D. in forestry from the University of Montana's Franke College of Forestry and Conservation. Mark recently published some fascinating research on the consequences of suppressing wildfires. Beyond his academic research, Mark is a gifted science communicator using many media, including film, music, and photography.
Music without that extra element of humanity, that spark of creativity, is pretty dull and doesn't do much. And I think the same is true of science.
Mark, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, so tell us, where did you grow up and what did your parents do?
Yeah, I'm from Kansas, originally South Central Kansas, so grew up in a land with a lot less trees, but lots of fire, grass fires. And my dad currently works in a museum, kind of building exhibits, doing exhibit design. And my mom was a pastor for a lot of my life, and now is sort of in church administration.
So we have to start out with huge congratulations. You just earned your PhD. You've been a student a long time, and now you're sort of released into the wild. Maybe summarize your path as a student.
Most of my life, except for one gap here before undergrad, has been as a student.
Yeah.
So I'm really excited to kind of spread my wings after this. But it's been a great journey. I did college in a small college in northern Indiana. Studied I guess ecology and music. Then went to Utah State to do a master's in fire ecology before finding myself here in Missoula, also studying fire and forest ecology.
Yeah, how did you get interested in fire?
During undergrad, we had some prairie restorations on campus.
Okay. And
so as part of classes, students would help burn those prairies in the spring. And it was just fascinating to see this process fire that is, a very, very common process, very powerful process, and one that both kind of destroys and kills plants, but also paves the way for new growth. And I found that kind of juxtaposition really fascinating.
And how do you then sort of put together an academic program of study to pursue this interest?
Well, I think one of the really cool things about fire, and this is true about many subjects, but I think particularly fire, is that it draws in all these different threads, especially out here in the Western U.S. I mean, of course, there's the ecological angle, which is kind of what my training is grounded in. But you can't really look at that without considering the human elements as well. So things like public health, politics, fire management, law and policy. And so it's really interesting field because it draws all those elements. And so it kind of facilitates a well-rounded education and getting to work with a lot of interesting people who are working on really different things, but that are all unified by this common problem, common process.
And at what stage did you start to kind of understand that the human relationship with wildfire is a complicated one? It's particularly, I don't want to necessarily classify it as dysfunctional here in the American West, but it's certainly got its problems here in the West.
Learning about fire through education is through the history of fire management and the history of how humans are related to fire in this place. And of course, that starts with native groups for thousands of years. Once Western colonization occurs, quickly moves into a more kind of foe relationship, seeing fire as enemy and trying to suppress fire. And we're starting to come out of that. I think we still have definite vestiges of that. And it's difficult. I mean, you get all these new added influences of humans living in places that burn, expansion of cities and communities. Yeah, I think it's fascinating to see the history of fire and this thread of how we've related to fire. And it's challenging, it's difficult, but I think it's important to learn from folks who've been living with fire for thousands of years.
Let's get right into this recent publication you and your colleagues have put out there about the consequences of suppressing wildfire. There's sort of been some knowledge of the consequences of suppressing wildfires as far as fuel accumulation and so forth, but you and your colleagues found something new, the suppression bias. First, what is the suppression bias? And once we sort of define that, we'll talk about what it all means.
The suppression bias arises from the fact that we don't suppress fires equally, and instead it's much easier to suppress fires under kind of moderate and low weather conditions. So when it's not windy, when fuel moistures are relatively high, it's much more difficult to suppress fires under windy, hot, and dry conditions. So what this leads to is that we suppress some fires very effectively, and the fires that escape, the fires that end up burning in most places are only these more extreme, more kind of fast-spreading fires. And so that this bias leads to sort of a disproportionate representation of the fires on the landscape.
Is this a selection bias, meaning we're choosing to put out these fires under these certain conditions, or is it just a function of those sorts of fires under those conditions are easier to put out than the ones that sort of grow into the more severe wildfires?
It is a selection bias, but it's definitely not I guess intentional.
Okay.
It just arises by the fact that if we try to suppress all fires, really we only end up suppressing some of the fires, and some are essentially impossible to suppress.
Yeah. Okay. And so downstream, what are the consequences of this?
Yeah, well, it leads to, like I think here in the state of Montana, we suppress about 96% of fires before they reach 10 acres. So in many regards, fire suppression is highly effective, very successful.
Right.
But those 4% of fires that are not suppressed under 10 acres, those end up accounting for much of the area burned. And those fires tend to be high severity, tend to be more destructive and catastrophic. Fires that would potentially be easier to manage, be more productive on the landscape, not kill all the trees. We kind of get rid of those fires preferentially, and we're basically left with these fires that in many cases don't really meet needs, ecological needs, social needs, and instead kill trees, are destructive, and pose safety threats.
What I'm hearing is that we're successful in putting out the fires that are relatively easy to put out. And one of the consequences of that are these fires that are relatively easy to put out could also be useful to the landscape as far as fuels management, ecological values, so forth. Is that essentially part of the mechanism?
Yeah, definitely. I think you capture it well there.
Okay. And so one of the notes in the paper is that this effect, the suppression bias, leads to more severe fires over and above the effects of mere fuel accumulation and climate change. So one of the reasons people are starting to understand the sort of growing severity of wildfires is climate change. That seems like an obvious one for people to get their head around. But the fuel accumulation piece is another one that people are starting to get their head around. You're proposing or finding, you and your colleagues have found a new mechanism to sort of contribute to the severity the fires we're experiencing.
And it's different in some ways than climate change and fuel accumulation, because those kind of raise the absolute levels of fire severity.
Okay.
With more fuel, with hotter and drier conditions. The fire suppression bias doesn't change the maximum possible values, but by taking out all those kind of the low end of fires, it raises the average. And we find that it actually raises the average more over the course of about 100 years or so than would happen from climate change or from fuel accumulation.
So you mentioned 100 years or so. Talk about your methods, because you use computer simulation. How does that all work when we're talking about fire on a landscape?
Well, one of the big issues with studying fire suppression is that it's very difficult to get good data on how effective a suppression is.
How would you even do that without a computer model? Like how do, we'll get to your video about the Bitterroot-Selway wilderness in a moment, but how do ecologists, how have they historically studied these sorts of questions?
Well, yeah. You can look at how much money was spent to suppress a fire, which is in theory a proxy for how much effort was put into that fire. If it was kind of a hands-off approach, or if it was all forces being called in.
Sure, although probably a listener can understand the flaws with that measure, but it is a measure.
It is a measure, and of course there's many confounding factors: how rugged the terrain was, how much it cost to bring in engines and other things. It also depends on how many fires were burning elsewhere and how kind of limited resources were. So for all those big reasons, we chose to first kind of approach this question from a simulation standpoint, where we could control all the factors, kind of fine tune, and keep everything constant except for fire suppression.
Okay.
So basically, our framework was we used mathematical models, and we basically grew fires, a bunch of fires, millions of fires, over a wide range of weather conditions and fuel conditions. And then using these kind of identical fires, we changed just the dial of fire suppression. So in some cases, we would suppress fires as much as possible, using models that relate, how intense a fire is with how effective different types of fire suppression are.
And these models are based on a bunch of historical data, essentially?
Yeah, and there's tons of data that goes into this across the globe. And then in other fires, we would maybe have a more hands-off approach. We wouldn't suppress fire at all. Other times we would let fires burn under low and moderate intensity conditions. But then once it sort of the weather got more fire prone, then maybe in the model we would kind of hit the fire harder. So we had all these different types of suppression, and then we could look at the output and look at how the average fire severity, estimated number of trees killed, like a bunch of metrics that we can use to quantify sort of what are the impacts of this fire.
How are you conceptualizing landscape and distribution of species and things like that? Like, are you sort of modeling a particular piece of land, or are you somehow merging a bunch of different types of landscapes?
There are models that can do, actual, like you basically build a model landscape with trees in certain locations and, rocks and slope angles and stuff, like all sorts of mountain features.
Yeah.
Those models take a very, very long time to run. They're very complex. And so for this project, since we wanted to simulate millions of fires, we went with a much simpler approach, where basically we're running fire through a landscape that's flat and comprised of kind of one fuel type for that whole fire.
Yeah.
And we do this for all sorts of different types of landscapes, so different amounts of fuel, different weather conditions. But this sort of assumes that fire can spread as long as far as possible, so there's no fuel breaks across this imaginary landscape, and it's kind of one slope angle the whole way through.
So you have to make some simplifying assumptions to make it actually doable.
Exactly,
in some ways.
From like processing time and things like that. But there are folks definitely working on very, very complex physics-based models that almost they almost run slower than real life.
So let's pull the lens back a little bit, because we gotten a little in the weeds of methodology and whatnot, but key takeaway we mentioned already is that there's this component of selection bias in the fires we decide to put out, and a lot of those fires that we're successful in putting out would have utility to the landscape and the ecosystem. What are their kind of translate some other policy implications from your study? Like, how do you think about our current approach to wildfire with what you've learned not only through this work but your other work about how can we actually try to do things better?
I'm a fire scientist, and so I obviously know the need of science and hope that there is a need of science going forward. But I do think that in large part the issues we face aren't scientific in nature. We already have a really good grasp on how fires burn, how they interact with climate and fuels and things like that, how we expect fires to change going into the future. So I think much of the kind of issues of this fire crisis that we face are political, are social, are kind of psychological as well. Of course, we need good science to inform decisions.
Yeah.
But I think we already know, and this paper kind of adds a new angle to it. But we already knew before that the fire suppression as kind of a blanket policy everywhere all the time has major consequences and probably isn't going to get us out of this problem.
We'll be back to my conversation with Mark Kreider after this short break. A New Angle is proudly presented by First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. This show does not happen without these pillars of our community, and I'm so grateful for their support and encouragement. And speaking of support, have you checked out our new website yet? anewanglepodcast.com. There you can support our show directly with a variety of subscription options. Subscribers get access to bonus episodes, additional segments, writings, and other benefits. So check it out at anewanglepodcast.com.
Hi, this is Anya Jabor, Regents Professor of History at the University of Montana, and you are listening to A New Angle.
Welcome back to A New Angle. I'm speaking with fire scientist Mark Kreider about the consequences of wildfire suppression. It's probably a useful time to transition into some of your other modes of communication. Like, not only are you often running as a fire scientist, you also are an accomplished musician, budding filmmaker with successful modes of communication across a variety of media. Talk about that aspect of your life and how you choose to communicate about wildfire and other domains.
Yeah, I think that as scientists, it's easy. I mean, we have to share our work in certain ways in the field through academic papers, such as we were talking about just now, through presentations at conferences and things like that. But I think these modes of communication, while essential and important, definitely are kind of limited and don't necessarily reach most people.
Yeah.
And so, sort of the main goal behind my communication projects is to expand the audience with which expand the folks who are interacting with fire science. Think about these topics maybe in new ways and with kind of up to date new research. So I like you said, I've done that through music recently. Performed a piano recital of fire-inspired pieces that related to different components of fire, from the fire triangle to a piece about climate change and in increasing fire activity. And so I mean, all these things are kind of ways to invite people to approach a topic that they probably know a lot about, if you live in the Western U.S., but approach it in kind of a new perspective, create a space that maybe isn't as charged or political, by having people see things with new curiosity, perhaps. And I think that can help start conversations and help open kind of avenues of dialogue.
Yeah, can you talk about some personal experiences in that space? I mean, I'm sure going through the review process in an academic paper, presenting your paper at a conference, that's one set of experiences. But like the intersection of your music with a live audience, or your film being seen at a festival, or talk about those experiences and how you've interacted with your audience in different ways.
Well, I think I'm accurate in saying that no paper that I've ever written has brought folks to tears. But that does happen with music. But I think there are all these really cool ways of communicating that we have as humans.
Yeah.
That bring in the more emotional side, which as scientists, we're often taught not to do that. I mean, for a good reason. We want to be objective and make sure that the questions we're asking and how we're answering them aren't kind of clouded by our own goals or what we want to see. But I think in art, those things don't matter as much. And I mean, it's much more okay to sort of have a goal through art. And I think people can gain a lot more from that sort of thing that they can't, from these other avenues. So yeah, it's been really fun to talk with people afterwards, interact with people from the film, from recitals who have been touched by that music or by those stories.
Yeah, you've grounded yourself in a culture and a reward system where academic research is the coin of the realm. Yet within that, you've allocated a lot of energy and creative force to these other areas of your life. How have you allocated your time and effort, knowing that you're as a scientist, you're in one system of rewards, yet you're sort of playing in other systems as well?
Those reward systems are good to a point.
Yeah.
I think we are hopefully kind of changing what we prioritize, beyond just publishing. So I like to think that, going into the future, it's more accepted that, lots of your time and energy might also be spent interacting with the public, with communities, making podcasts, such as this, or other ways of sharing research and work. But yeah, I've been very well supported here during my Ph.D. from my advisor and many others, through kind of unconventional means of sharing research. I would also say that for me personally, part of it at least is just because it's fun, and it makes me, I think, a more happy scientist, being able to do these other things.
Yeah, and we've framed this as if your science informs your other forms of art, whether that's film or music or photography. Does that causal mechanism run the other way? Do your artistic pursuits sometimes inform your scientific thoughts and questions you're asking?
Well, yeah, I would say that they definitely share lots of overlaps. I've been studying piano for almost 25 years or so at this point, and I mean there's a high level of precision and like in music, and in this case piano, that is shared in science. We have to be very good at coding and all these kind of hard skills, but also music without that extra element of humanity, that spark of creativity is pretty dull. and doesn't do much. And I think the same is true of science, where we have to have really grounded methods and frameworks, but also there's a whole bunch of creativity in science. And so, yeah, I would say that definitely have been inspired by my other interests and other pursuits.
Has it made you a better writer?
In the sense that story is very important, especially in filmmaking, in other forms of art.
Yeah.
Journalism, obviously, but I think in science, often, again, we're not always taught from an early age the importance of story, because stories are often seen as you can tell a story many different ways, and there should be just one correct, scientific, true way. But I think people are realizing more and more that stories are how humans make meaning of things, and so I think that's been a big area where my artistic side has helped.
I'd love in our remaining time to ask some questions about a different area of research for you. You do work on equity in access to wilderness and other equity issues in wild spaces. Talk about that area of inquiry. What sort of questions are you interested in?
I think as folks who study natural landscapes and recreate on natural landscapes, I think there is some sort of a responsibility to ensure that those benefits from those places are not just available to us or to a select few, but that these public lands were really designed to be available to all. And so in this work, we've been helping to create maps looking at where people have good access to public lands, where the access is very low, and then what steps we can maybe take with that data to help ensure that every American and every person in general has access and benefits from natural spaces.
By design, we're supposed to be equal owners of the resource, so we should have equal access. Now, some of that is driven by where we choose to live and so forth, to the extent we have choice in that decision. But any big surprises in that work, or particularly pernicious findings that you found? Or I shouldn't necessarily categorize them as pernicious, but what are some of the most interesting findings you've come across in that space?
I'd say the first is that access, I think, has kind of two major angles. There, of course, there is the geographic component.
Mm-hmm.
So if you live here in Missoula, Montana, you kind of right off the bat have really good access, just by virtue of living very, very close to lots of public land. However, and by contrast, if you grew up somewhere in like Iowa, for instance, potentially there are not really many national forests. Certainly not many national parks or wilderness areas close by.
Yeah.
But I think that the issue of access goes deeper than that. And so there's the second kind of component, which is more social access. And so all these various barriers and boundaries that folks have to overcome in order to access public land. So that could be, do you have access to a car? Do you have time off from work on the weekends? It takes time and money to access and recreate. Are you part of a community that has historically been marginalized within the park system? Does it feel like a national park or a wilderness area is a space for people like you? There's all sorts of reasons why folks might not feel safe in outdoor spaces. And so many folks maybe, if you've grown up accessing public lands, you might not really feel these barriers, but for a lot of people, these barriers kind of compound on one another and effectively, I guess, reduce the possible area within which you might be willing or able to travel.
Do we know anything about interventions that sort of help reduce some of this disparity that you're describing?
Yeah, well, I think there's very kind of tangible on the ground infrastructure ways, like, for instance, good public transport.
Yep.
Out of cities. For instance, for example, Salt Lake City is an example of investing in infrastructure to get folks into the mountains if you don't have a car. But I think even more important than that is changes in culture. Having diverse staffs who are managing public lands is important. Having opportunities for youth and other folks who might not have grown up in families that where they learn skills of how to go outdoors, or might not even want to go outdoors if it hasn't been something that was prioritized.
Sure.
So I think it's important for opportunities for folks like that. So groups that help people get outdoors, help overcome those financial barriers, since a lot of the toys that people use are hugely expensive.
Yes, they are.
And can be a big barrier there as well.
So, Mark, what's next for you? You just walked across the stage and earned that Ph.D., a long, hard-fought battle to do that. You're off to a postdoc position. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I'll be staying here in Missoula. I'm working on as a forest scientist with the Nature Conservancy.
Okay.
On a project in collaboration with the Forest Service that kind of seeks collectively to explore old growth and mature forest across the whole U.S. So it's part of a much larger project to kind of identify where these old forests are, and then identify risks to these forests and how we might mitigate those through things like active management, unprescribed fire, and other kind of climate adaptation strategies.
And do you have ambitions to join a faculty somewhere, or like what's your long-term vision of how you're going to put your skills to work?
I think certainly a faculty position is of interest to me. I think it's a really cool environment to work at a university where you can easily collaborate with folks across colleges, across disciplines. Also, it's a place to collaborate, for instance, with music faculty and do cool projects like that. But I'm interested right now to get some experience working with a nonprofit and with federal agencies. I think those are hugely important partners in many of the land management challenges that we face. And so for the time being, I'm really excited to work with those folks. But yeah, going forward, I'm who knows? But I have many interests, and I hope to be able to implement those.
Yeah, you've opened a lot of doors in your young career, so you have a lot of you have options, which I love to see. So as you kind of think about this next step, and as you allocate efforts going forward, like how would you describe the biggest questions that you can contribute to?
I think the biggest overriding goal is to help society. I should say, I guess anticipate what we might expect going forward with all these big sources of change, climate change, changing patterns of where folks live, and help to develop tools and frameworks with which to best address those and best adapt to those.
Well, Mark, I have to say you've demonstrated a lot of flexibility and opportunity for growth and dynamism in your young career. I'm really excited to see what you do next and applaud you for just using your skills across a broad array of media to engage with people about important topics. So keep it up, and I hope we can check in down the road.
Thanks so much. I'm glad to be here and been supported by so many people here during my career, from my advisor and my committee, and all the many collaborators. So I also would be remiss to not thank them.
Absolutely. I'm sure they're very proud. So Mark, all the best. We'll talk soon.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to A New Angle. If you like what we do and want to support us directly, please consider a subscription at anewanglepodcast.com. A New Angle is recorded at Studio 49, a generous gift from UM alums Michelle and Lauren Hansen. Our presenting sponsors are First Security Bank, Blackfoot Communications, and the University of Montana College of Business. Kelly Larson is our producer. Maddie Jordan is our production assistant. VTO, Jeff Ament, and John Wicks made our music. And Jeff Meese is our master of all things sound. Thanks a lot, and see you next time.